By the time I'm reading this script out to you right now, it will have been about 10 years since the passing of Colin Wickoff, otherwise known as Kitty or Elliot. I really can't put into words just how much all of these animations have influenced me throughout my whole life, and the fact that I've still never played most Valve games impresses me because I always come back to this every single year. The thing is, I've never really been capable of putting into words what captivates me about Team Fabulous 2. I've always been watching this thing casually, which I'm sure was kind of the intention of the whole thing. Although something strange happened in January, I started really thinking this over, and now something started to click, and I started to analyze it. Clearly there's a reason why I keep coming back to this, why I never get tired of it, and now I think I can give a few of those pointers as concisely as possible, so I wanted to delve into that. What better way to remember an iconic creator who inspired so many of us at such a young age than to take a little look at one of my favorite Gmod animations of all time. It's hard to talk about Team Fabulous 2 without mentioning the amazing start. This tells you basically everything you need to know about the animation and sort of mirrors a lot of Team Fortress 2 matches on its own, while also keeping the tone of how Valve made their meet the trailers and expiration date. By the time you think you've figured everything out, you already noticed that the timer has gone wonky, and then you've been switched to the next team's perspective. The fact that it overwhelms you right away is pretty impressive, and perfectly done for what it wants to accomplish, and I don't think this would have been possible without the audiovisual aspect to it. There are a lot of impressive shots and angles in this, especially considering the limitations of Gmod. I'm always impressed when funny things can go the extra mile to make dynamic shots and actually try with some of these things, especially considering how Cohen's comedies are shot, and I think this is no different here. There's a lot of great bits that give you focus on one specific character, which is already impressive, considering the wide cast we have and how it's impossible to tell anyone apart, besides the hats they're wearing. I also really like how there's always something going on in the background. Even if you have the amazing visual gag at hand, there's always something else to look at, and that really ties it all together properly. I also really like the vibrant aspect of the whole map itself, and all the posters that come with it. It really has a sort of Y2K feel that really strengthens this, at least to me. Of course, you can't forget the visual aspect of Gmod itself. Every single character moves like an action figure here, and they ragdoll wonderfully. There's a sort of low-quality, dirty look to all of this, and what I mean by that is typically just kind of how a lot of these characters under this engine look in general, and how they move, as I mentioned. I'm bringing this up because I've been thinking about why SMG4 doesn't really work for me with this style anymore. And I guess it's because SMG4 characters move in such safe and specific ways that it doesn't really do much when they just flop around. In old Gmod animations, there's a lot more freedom to how everyone is portrayed, as you can quickly tell just by looking at it. The characters are just so unpolished and malleable, I kinda love it, especially for something like this specifically. And I guess about now would be the perfect time to discuss just how this sounds and how that works. The limitations of using only voice lines from the actual game is just perfect. It really adds to that whole game lobby feel, and it adds a bit of a pause between all of this chaos and stooge comedy that it has going for it.
Build in a sentry.
Hey, overalls, you suck.
That's what you get.
It feels so much more natural for characters to talk like this. It fit much more for Elliot Goes to School and characters were talking fully, since it was just kinda meant to be an annoying middle to high school experience. Team Fabulous 2 differs by its audiovisual aspect being used for storytelling most of the time. It also can't be missed just by listening to this how impressive these sound effects are for this. I'm so glad they chose this specific set because I'm the kind of person who would watch nothing but Ed, Edd and Eddy my whole life, and I also experienced a lot of Happy Wheels, so naturally hearing a lot of those sounds in this was absolutely fucking brilliant.
Oh!
I'm also glad Kitty was secure and professional enough to add farts every couple seconds into this. It's perfect.
Satisfied.
The fuck?
To a lesser extent, there's a lot of great comedic timing with just the songs alone. And at this point, I think there's one last thing I want to discuss, which is the continuity and perspective. Team Fabulous 2 keeps itself fresh by constantly shifting perspective between all of the mercs and both of the teams. There's running gags with these characters, and there's a lot that you can learn about them just by looking at the hats they're wearing. Okay, maybe not, I just really like the detail that a lot of them have different hats. And by the time you think you've seen basically everything, it throws you into a graffiti gag, which even adds to the continuity of it feeling like a game lobby once again. And then there's a random 2D section, and then it just throws you into another side of it entirely. I have a confession. The second act of Team Fabulous 2 is something I used to skip when I was a kid because it kinda confused and bored me a bit. I guess it's easy to ignore them when there was a lot of chaos prior, although I think it's much more important now that I finally understand it, or at least have my own take on it now. It also really helps recontextualize why it focuses on the blue engineer with his little cowboy hat. This engineer creates as expression. He creates because he can, and that becomes very relevant to what they're trying to do much later on. This last bit starts to make a lot more sense once you realize that this is in Gmod, a game engine, and you realize it's based off of Team Fortress 2, which is a gigantic, expressive multiplayer game, with lots of freedom attached to it. The way this creature sort of traps all the mercs in their own little separate spots and isolates them is really interesting to me. They were all sort of expressing themselves by playing and fighting. Gmod and TF2 worked together extremely well. They both have a very similar sense of freedom, and this is shown really well in the first half, with how all the heavies are driving and racing together, how the blue team is fine dining, and how all the spies just don't give a fuck about anything. This engineer understood this the most. He knew exactly why these characters, and more extensively these players, were all here to begin with. If you were raised around this time, it's easy to presume that this is basically your only time of freedom, when you're out online. When you're playing a game, whether by yourself or with an online friend, or making something like a story for the hell of it. When you're still learning around the world at this time, it can feel like there's an overwhelming amount of people who are constantly reminding you that you're doing something wrong, or that you need to be controlled. And at that point, the only place you really feel you can be yourself is right here, in this moment, in this little Gmod space. The reason why this engineer was put in charge of taking down this creature was because he knew exactly what it would mean for the lobby. And after the gigantic epic finale, all that exists is this, the craft of it all. I really like that Team Fabulous 2 ends in such a calm way. All that's left to do is really just create, and be free, and live with yourself, and when I think about Kitty during that time, this becomes a lot more powerful. Colin existed during a time with a lot of limitations, and yet a lot of freedom. And while I realize that this is mostly meant to be just funny and stupid, it's also probably Colin's biggest expression. It's got basically everything he had to offer, and that's just magical to me. This makes this one animation mean a lot more. It's so tragic to have lost someone who was about as old as I am now when he was gone, but the fact that we're still talking about this 10 years later is a testament to everything he put into this. When I look at Team Fabulous 2 now, I like to think about it's the creation of art and the mind of the author. So anyway, that's just the most that I wanted to say. This was intended to be a lot longer at first because I kind of wanted an epic video for an epic animation, but I like leaving it at this. And who knows, maybe this isn't the only video I have to make about Team Fabulous 2. I can always come back to this, and I think I eventually will.